Good evening, friends. Thank you very much for being here with us in our opening for the Thursday's lectures. And it is true, when I said I want to talk about what happens after we die, Paula was kind of, well, do you really think we should start with that subject? And I think it's a very hopeful view of existence, including what we call life and what we call death. So I really think this is a good way to start our season, because if we know what life is about, and we know what the purpose of the processes in life and the purpose of the processes after what we call death are intended for, we can live in a very intelligent way. Usually we are born and we just stumble our way through life. Hopefully we come in touch with some spiritual tradition, some serious spiritual tradition, where we can start making sense of what happens in our lives. And I would say in almost all religious or philosophical traditions that have a spiritual purpose, what happens after death is seen as something really important. And also, if we are people that are trying to understand life, every tradition says that there is a state of being which is full of a bliss that we don't know. We don't know during our life on earth. However, as a culture, we grow with this fear of death. It doesn't happen so much in other cultures. This is a feature of our Western culture, because we see how in many other countries there are people that can give up their lives quite easily, many times for the wrong reasons. But there is not so much of this attachment to life. I don't know why. Some people say, well, maybe because of the idea of hell, that we have in the Christian view. But every religion has a view of hell, or several hells. None of them usually, or few of them are considered, these hells are regarded to be eternal. That may be a reason, but maybe it's just that the Western civilization is very focused on the physical life, on practicality, on our senses. And maybe that's why we have a more attachment to this plane of reality. But anyway, as we understand more what happens after death, then we can face our lives in a very different way, in a way that is, I think, more grounded and with more understanding. Now, how do we know about this? How do we know what happens after death? We have the teachings from enlightened beings, or from prophets, or from divine beings. The teachings that the Buddha gave, or Jesus, or different kind of yogis in India. And the idea is that we have as the possibility to access what we call the postmortem states while being alive. In more Western terminology, we would say a person that is clairvoyant and can see beyond the physical plane, can see a plane or a dimension or a state in which people who died are having their life, their experiences. And he can see that and communicate it to us. Throughout history, there are many people that claimed to be able to see this. And it's similar to what happens with science. Scientists claim to be able to see the atom. And they say there is something like an atom. None of us probably ever saw an atom or worked with an atom, but we believe the community of scientists who say that they know. None of us probably saw the DNA, but we believe that there is a DNA. And many times the models are wrong. The model of the atom that science developed is being constantly corrected. So even if you have the wrong model, you still can trust in the basic teaching, in the basic knowledge, for example, that there is an atom, and we build our society around this knowledge. We have many things that are done. Even electricity is based on the knowledge of what an atom is. So with these postmortem states that humanity goes through, we may have a similar attitude. There is a group of people that claim to be able to acquire a knowledge at that level. And we have to take it and think if it sounds reasonable for us, and if it enlightens our life, if it shows us how to live in a different way. So if it does, we can take it as a hypothesis. For the time being, I will try to understand life from this point of view. Because the truth is that either position, whether there is something after death or there is nothing after death, is just a hypothesis, it's just an idea. Some scientists say, there is no proof that there is anything beyond death. Well, there is no proof that there isn't. It's just a position. You choose this philosophical view or that philosophical view. It's like saying, I never saw the other face of the moon. So there is no proof that there is any other face in behind the moon, what we see. Well, the fact that you don't perceive it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means only that you don't have the means to perceive it. So both positions are a philosophical approach, either that there is something or there isn't. If for you the idea that there is nothing beyond death works and allows you to live better, to be a better person, then go for it. But if this other view helps you to have a different kind of life, then there is no reason why you shouldn't take it as a hypothesis, and work, try to live, seeing life from that perspective. So tonight we are going to see how this subject is described in the Theosophical view. There are many parallels with many other traditions that I don't have time to draw these parallels. Maybe I will mention a little bit with Christianity because we are more familiar with this tradition usually. But let us try to see the purpose or the light that this knowledge can throw on our lives. So I will use the board because there are several diagrams that will help us understand this subject. The same way that life is very complex, the processes after life are also very complex. So I will give you the general information that we have about this. Theosophy has a very detailed account of things that happen after death, and also different people go through the post-mortem process in a different way, just like we go through life in a different way. And the times are also different, but we can draw some generalities and talk about what the general rule is, just as we could say that the general lifespan for a human being can go up to 90 years old, for example. There are people that go beyond. There are people that die before reaching 90 years old. But we could say today in this particular culture, that could be, a lifespan that could be taken as a rule, 80, 90 years old. So in the same way, we will talk about these processes that could be applied to the generality, but they are not fixed. So in order to understand the whole process, we have to have certain knowledge about the universe and the human being. Are we only the physical body that we perceive? Is the universe only the physical dimension that we perceive? Or is there anything else? And of course, if we are talking about a life that is beyond the physical life, then we are postulating that there are dimensions that are beyond the physical, what we can perceive through our senses. So let us start from the essence of a human being, how Theosophy sees a human being, and let us see also the different components of the universe. So the idea in Theosophy is that there is a single universal self. This is the reality. We could call it God or the Logos or whatever way you want to call it in your tradition. But the idea is that this is the source of everything. Now, the word self may also be misleading, because when we say self, we are not referring to a self as we understand it. A self as an individual with conditioning or with a sense of personality. This is something universal. So we could call it the universal non-self, and that would be equally precise. In fact, in Theosophy, many times it is said the self which is non-self, or the non-self which is the one being. So let us not get misled by the words. But the idea is that this universal self manifests in the conditioned realm, in the conditioned universe, and in that manifestation, it takes different features. Just like, for example, you have one single tree. That tree is feeding from certain nutrients, from the sun, from the environment, but it produces all different kind of leaves. So although everything comes from the same, the way it develops produces a diversity. So this universal self develops also in different expressions that in Theosophy is called like the higher self. It's similar to the concept of the soul. We are going to go to use more precise words later, but I want to give you the general idea. So this universal self could be seen as the spirit. You know, in Christianity, in some theologians and some mystics, they made the difference between spirit, soul, and body. So they would talk, spirit shares certain essence with God. The soul is the individual aspect of human beings, and that soul can become eternal or can perish. So this spirit, being part of God in some way or the other, is eternal. But the soul has to gain that eternity, that possibility of being eternal. And then we have the body. The body, as we know, lasts during our life, and then it is dissolved. So this universal self expresses through the soul that in Theosophy many times is called also higher ego. Ego not in the psychological meaning, because when these teachings were given in late 1900s, the modern psychology had not been developed at that time, and the word ego is more used in the philosophical sense, like the origin of the sense of I-ness. This higher ego is impersonal, spiritual, is the pure sense of I-ness. It's not the reality. The reality is the universal self. But during the process of human evolution, this is like our permanent self, our permanent I. Because the idea is that this higher self, you will get the whole picture as I go on. So don't worry if right now there are some missing links. But the idea is that this higher ego lives, if we want to put it that way, in a high plane of the universe, a high state of consciousness. I'm going to explain the planes in a little bit. This higher ego manifests on the physical plane as what we call the personality. So we have like three sources of self: the universal self, the higher ego, and the personality. The personality is a physical body, our emotions, and our mind. So the personality is what we know about ourselves, usually. In our daily life, we relate to each other as personalities. And when in our spiritual moments, so to say, we may get in touch with our higher ego. That's the highest in ourselves. So this personality consists of mind, emotions, and the body. So the whole process of being born and dying has to do with these three aspects, with our mind, our emotions, and our body. This higher ego is beyond death and beyond birth. This higher ego is permanent, relatively speaking. At a certain point in evolution, when the person gets enlightenment, this higher ego is also dissolved, and there is a realization of the universal self. But for the time being, this is our permanent self. So the idea is that in the universe, we have the physical plane that we all know, that we can perceive through our senses. Then there is another dimension that is subtler. It's more a kind of energy, although we could call it also matter, but it's a matter that is not perceived by the senses. So we could probably relate it better to a kind of energy. And that dimension in theosophy is usually called emotional plane or astral plane. The word astral plane is pretty much used in many traditions nowadays. So we have the physical plane, the astral plane, we have the mental plane, and beyond that is the higher ego. So we have a physical body, which we all know. This physical body has also a subtle counterpart that in theosophy is called etheric body. It's still physical, but it's, for example, with the Kirlian camera, you can take a picture of your hand, and you will see your hand and like energy going out of your hand. That energy is going through the etheric body. It's the medium through which that energy can flow. Then the person has also an emotional body or astral body, which can be seen by some clairvoyants, and it is called the aura. It's like a magnetic field that we have around. So this would be the astral body or emotional body. And we have also a mental body, or a mental body. So this is our personality, physical with the etheric counterpart, our emotional body, and our mental body. When we die, the first thing that happens is that the physical body stops working as a unity. When a person dies, it's not that the cells die. The cells are very much alive. There is something there that was keeping all the cells working together that is not anymore. And then the cells begin to work and live by themselves, not as a unity. So what happened is that what we call life, which was working through the etheric body, what we call life, retreats, and then the physical body dies. And consciousness stays for a while in the etheric body. So the idea is that when a person dies, the consciousness retires from there, but stays on the physical plane, on this subtler body, which is the etheric double. When this is happening, the person sees his or her whole life going through consciousness in all its details. We know about this because there are now, during the 20th century, there had been several near-death experiences, researches, where most people remember having this review of their whole lives. And this is something that according to the Theosophical teachings, happened to every single person. It doesn't matter how the person dies. It doesn't matter if the person was conscious or unconscious. If during that life the person was intellectually sound or wasn't, it doesn't matter how the person was. When the physical vitality retires from the physical body, in that process, the whole life is reviewed. And this is a very important moment because out of that review, there are certain scenes, desires, thought that were predominant during the life of that person that remain particularly strong. A person that was interested in some intellectual endeavor, out of that review, most things will go to, will be forgotten for the time being, but that intellectual interest will be very alive in the consciousness of the person. The same if the person was attached to somebody else or had some vice or craving or leading emotion. So whatever was relevant during life will be there, determining what the next experience will be after consciousness retires completely from the physical plane. So in Theosophy, it is said that the moment of death is so sacred that people who are around should not feel too violent emotions. Death should be taken, the death of a loved one should be taken as much as possible with love, in a philosophical way, because our violent emotions may resonate on this person, and in this review, the person will have an increase of these kind of emotions of mourn or sadness or something like that. So that may alter a little the experience that person is going to have after leaving the physical plane. So usually it is said, try to keep a quiet environment. Of course, there will be some sadness, that's okay, but don't let, too violent emotions or scenes happen around the person that is dying. So what happens immediately after this review is that the person falls into unconsciousness. Once the person falls into unconsciousness, cannot come back. All the near-death experiences go up to the level of this review and what happens right after that. But once the person falls into this unconsciousness, in normal cases, remains unconscious. This unconsciousness may last up to 36 hours, usually, and the consciousness is still on the etheric double. And then what happens is that consciousness retires from the etheric double and begin the life on the astral plane that we are going to see next. The etheric double is left behind and it disappears along with the body. The body begins to dissolve, and the etheric double goes on a process of dissolution along with the body, because they are actually, one is the counterpart of the other. So now begins a life on the astral plane, on this emotional plane. This astral plane, most of us, most people, know very well, although we don't remember. Because every time that we go to sleep, our consciousness leaves the body and stays on the astral plane. That's why in most philosophies they say sleeping and death are siblings. They are the same, but in one case, the consciousness cannot return to the body when we die, and in the other case, when we are sleeping, consciousness returns after we wake up. But this plane is not completely unknown for most of us. If the person has certain spiritual interest and certain intellectual development, it is said that that person is usually aware on the astral plane, more or less. Some people are like in a kind of bubble without being really aware what is there on the astral plane, but they are still aware of their own reality on the astral plane. And some other people are completely aware to the surroundings. But we are actually not going to a place that is completely unknown. And the person realizes that when the person awakens on the astral plane. Now, not everybody awakens on the astral plane. Let me say something first. If we compare these planes, which are also states, with the teachings in Christianity, especially in Catholicism, because after the Reformation, these teachings were removed from the Protestantism. But in Catholicism, we have the idea of life, then let me put life, then the purgatory, and then heaven. These correspond perfectly with the idea of the physical life, the astral life, and the mental life. The purgatory in Catholicism is like an intermediate state for people who are not spiritually enough to be accepted in heaven right away. So the soul stays in an intermediate state where it's purging the sins or the impurities and is cleaning itself to become ready to enter in this state of lofty spirituality that heaven implies. The purgatory may be something, there may be suffering in the purgatory or not. The purgatory may be just like a waiting room, or it may be painful according to how much the soul has to purify itself. So this life on the astral plane has a lot of those features, and we are going to see in more or less detail. But people who are spiritual, who are really spiritual, people who don't have attachments to life, they go through life and they have, relationships with people, but really their main concern was not related to the physical life. They go through the astral plane without even noticing that they are on the astral plane. In a kind of deep sleep, they go fast, maybe in a few hours, maybe in a few days, and they awaken in a state of bliss that we don't know on earth, on our physical life, in what in Christianity is called heaven. In Theosophy, usually it is called devachan. Deva means gods in Sanskrit. Chan means place, so the place of the gods. And gods in a symbolic way. It's a more divine state if you compare it with the physical life. So the point is that spiritual people don't need to pass through this purgatory. They go through the astral plane right away in a faster or slower rate, let's say, right away to the state of bliss that is in devachan, in heaven. Now, people who are attached to the physical plane, they may wake up at any level of the astral plane. Now, I have to say that this astral plane has like subplanes. The lower subplane, this is a diagram. When we talk about, all this is interpenetrating. It's not that the astral plane begins somewhere there up, or above our heads. When a clairvoyant sees a human being, he or she sees a physical body, and the emotional body is right here, and the mental body is right here. Usually, since they are less dense, they go a little further, than the physical body, but they are all interpenetrating each other. So when we put the planes like this, one on top of the other, it's just to indicate the level of subtlety of that matter. So the idea is that, for example, the first subplane of the astral plane, the lowest of all, is said to be what most religions call hell. It's a very dense state. It's a state that most people go through unaware, because the only way to perceive it is if in your life you had very violent emotions. I have to say something more, that the idea is that when consciousness leaves the physical body and the etheric body, it stays on the emotional body. Now there is no physical body, there is no etheric double. So our body now, for the time being, is the emotional body. This emotional body has the ability to respond to all kinds of emotions. We can be very angry, or we can have a deep state of love, all in the same person. Now these emotions, love and hate, they activate different emotional matter. It's just like physical matter, you have different states, solid, liquid, and gas. In the same way, the astral matter has different states, 7 states. Whatever emotion is very passional, animal, selfish, it moves the lower, the densest emotional energy or matter. And the lofty emotions move the highest planes of the emotional matter. So the idea is that after death, what happens, usually in people, is that there is a rearrangement in the emotional body. And the densest matter goes outside, and the emotional body creates like layers with the densest matter that you have in your emotional body, then subtler, as you go inside. So for example, most civilized people, so to say, don't have an emotional matter that is so low that could respond to the vibrations of the lowest of the astral plane. So we don't even have that emotional matter in our emotional body. And since we don't have matter to respond, it's like if we don't have senses to perceive that kind of state. So we go through that state without noticing it. But people like, murderers or people that are really in an intense sense or state of selfishness or violence, they may have this matter, and they may awaken on the lowest of the subplanes of the astral plane. So in that state, it's a state of constantly violent emotions. So they live there in this, being victims of all these emotions. And on the astral plane, every emotion takes a form. So many times these emotions are said to take, very scary forms. And the person doesn't realize, the person really thinks is in hell. Now, this will last only for a little while, because the idea is that this emotional matter has like an automatic motion or life, and little by little also dies. So this external shell of emotional matter that is relating them to that particular state, little by little dies also. When it dies, it goes away from the emotional body, and then you have the other layer, which belongs to a higher plane. So this suffering is usually relatively short according to how much of these emotions or how active these emotions were during life. And the purpose of this is that that state of suffering makes such an impact in consciousness that when the person incarnates again, because this explanation is based on a view that life repeats, in a cycle of reincarnation. So when that person reincarnates again, there is a natural tendency to avoid the cause of suffering, to avoid the actions and the emotions that caused so much suffering in the previous life. So sometimes the person has to go through that a couple of times or lifetimes, but usually every time that the person goes through that experience is imprinted in their consciousness, and there is a natural tendency to move away from that. But as I said, most people go through that subplane without even noticing it. Then the second subplane, it's one that is in touch with the world. It is said that this first subplane, if you want to see it spatially, is usually under the earth, because the planes overlap each other in certain ways. So the idea is that this plane is so dense that it's usually under the surface of the earth. And that's why also the idea that the hells are always, in many traditions are depicted as being below the earth. Now this second subplane is very connected with daily life, with the physical life. People who are awake on these planes are people who were really attached to the physical life, and that they had no interest beyond the drinking, eating, all the more biological needs. So they become aware, and they can see the physical world. Actually, they see the astral counterpart of people, things. But it is said that it's a state that is frustrating because they cannot communicate with them, and people there can see how, for example, if their children have a problem they cannot help, or if their wife or husband is with another person, these people who are aware on this plane are also usually very materialistic, very immature spiritually. So it is said that it's also a state that is not pleasant at all. It's a frustrating state. But with that also, consciousness learns not to be so attached to the physical life. Again, most people go through that second subplane unconscious. We don't even notice that. So the third and fourth subplanes are also more or less in touch with the physical life, but souls there are more looking forward to the process that is going on, that backwards. These souls don't have so much the appetite to remain attached to the physical plane. And also, people who are awake on those planes are usually also not very spiritual, but they are not so immature, spiritually speaking, or so selfish, or so attached. So the life there is not really suffering. It could be kind of boring for them. It happens, even in physical life. How many people, when they retire, they don't know what to do? On the astral plane, you don't have a job. You don't have any of your daily routine. You don't go to sleep. You don't get tired. For most people that are not attached to the physical plane, that is almost like heaven. Imagine you never get sick. You don't have anything in particular to do to sustain yourself. You have free time to explore the whole world, because the astral plane has the physical counterpart to what we see physically here. So you could go around the world and visit places, and in fact some people do, So if the person is more or less mature, even if it is not spiritually awakened, the time on the astral plane is a good time, but nothing like what the experience that soul will have on the mental plane, in devachan, in heaven. So it is kind of a waste of time, because that person could be at that time in a state of bliss and unity and perfection. But because of his or her attachment to the physical life, is still like in this waiting room on the astral plane. So the fifth state of matter on the astral plane is said to be like the heaven, the material heaven of the religions. By material heaven, I mean, when heaven is described like a city with gold streets in Christianity, or the prairie, the hunting place of the natives. These depictions of heaven in a very material and concrete way is usually found on the fifth subplane of the astral plane. And people there, it is said that they, build like churches, and they get together, people who have the same belief. So the idea is that the astral plane is actually not really different from the physical plane. Especially the higher subplanes are not really very different from the physical plane. But because of that, they are still material. And the spiritual soul aims at going beyond that, because there is this place, as I was saying, the resting place, a place of unity, a place of ineffable bliss that is beyond all these experiences. So then we have the sixth subplane that is usually said that souls who were more kind of artistic but still not spiritually mature, they stay on the sixth subplane. It is said to be very beautiful, one of the most beautiful subplanes on the astral plane. And the seventh subplane, which is so close to the mental plane, is where very intellectual people, especially if they are materialists, not intellectual and spiritual, it is said that that's the place where these kind of people awaken on the astral plane. So on the astral plane also they build like libraries, and they enjoy reading all the books that they want to enjoy. This may sound like fancy, but if you see the mechanic of what the astral plane is, it's just a counterpart of the physical plane. And the same way that we can build things on the physical plane, we can build things on the astral plane. But I don't have time to go through this. Now, the idea here is that there is another thing that is important. Where we are awakened depends on what our attachments were on life, during our life. And also we have to remember that on the astral plane, we don't have a physical body. So if our attachments require a physical body to be satisfied, we have a really hard time there. For example, if a person is really attached to drinking, to eating, to whatever thing really needs a physical body, on the astral plane, the desire is still there. We don't change at all on the astral plane. We are the same person with the same emotions, the same thinking, but without a physical body. So now we have a vice, let's suppose, smoking or whatever it is, and on the astral plane we cannot do that. And the desire is still there. So the problem is that on the astral plane, emotions, since this is the plane of the emotions are much stronger than on the physical plane. On the physical plane, the emotions, even the most violent ones, are dulled by the process of transmitting the emotion through the brain. So sooner or later, we have to kill a vice or an attachment by refraining from committing the action. So for example, if I want to fight against a vice, let's say smoking or whatever, what I have to do on the physical plane is just to stop gratifying that particular craving. And then little by little, that desires wears off, and eventually we are freed from that vice. If we don't do it during life, we will have to do it on the astral plane, because the desire will still be there, but there will be no way to satisfy it, and it will be a little harder there because the desire will be much stronger, and there will be no opportunity to say, okay, I indulge in it a little and tomorrow I go on. So it is always a very good thing to do things while we are on the physical plane, to try to purify ourselves while we are on the physical plane, because it is easier, and that will change our experience after we die. In most people, especially people who are interested in the spiritual life, probably they are not going to be awakened on the astral plane, or if they are, it'll be on the higher planes, which are not really painful. But again, if we have these attachments, we will have to go through that craving without being able to satisfy it. So for most people, there is almost no suffering after death. But once we purify all these desires, there is what is called a second death. Because what happened as a person went through one subplane to the higher one is that this astral body, little by little, gets dissolved. First, the grossest, matter, then the subtler and subtler. So little by little, it's like if we peel off a part of our emotional body. And eventually, we stay with the subtlest of all our emotions, and when we get freed from that, we enter in this state of heaven, or devachan, or sukhavati, in different traditions. And on the mental plane, there is no suffering can enter this state of devachan, because all causes of suffering were left behind on the astral plane. So when the person is being reborn on the mental plane, because this is like a second death, the person gets freed from the astral body, falls into a state of unconsciousness, is reborn in this higher state of heaven, and there is also, again, a review of the previous life, the life that just ended, but now only first the review is of all that happened in life, with a deep understanding of why each one of the things happened. There is a very objective and wise view of life, and the person knows that everything had a reason, that everything was just, and understands, at that point, why every single thing happened. And then the sad remembrances are left behind forever. And in devachan, only the happiest of the remembrances are kept, because, as I said, all the seeds for suffering were left behind at the boundary between the devachan and the astral plane. So in devachan, there is this state, as I said, of bliss. There are descriptions about this state, but it's misleading to talk about this. We can talk about the astral plane because it's still material. As I said, it's pretty much like the physical life. Now, the life on devachan, it's a completely different kind of life, existent dimension. Mystics that have these experiences of enlightenment and bliss and union are usually glimpses from that state that we can call heaven or devachan. So I don't want to go too much describing what the different states there, because I think the descriptions are more symbolical. But generally speaking, it is said that this plane has like two great divisions. The lower planes are more concrete, and they are called the planes of form, and the higher planes are subtler. Actually, the lower planes are at this level, and the higher planes in the mental plane are at the level of the higher ego. You know, the higher ego is in what in Theosophy is called the higher mental plane. And what we call our mental body is in the lower mental plane. So the idea is that if the person was deeply spiritual, will go again through the lower planes of the mental and be one with the soul, with the pure soul. We one with the essence of what we are as human beings. Although remember that there is the divine spark that is behind this higher ego or this soul. But for the time being, for us, this is our real self, and it's a state that is beyond any description. During these states, so the physical life is when we gather experience. It's like the laboratory. We come to the physical plane, we have all that interaction, and we gather experience. Hopefully we learn, but basically we gather experience. On the astral plane, that plane is mostly a plane of purification. We sift these experiences. Little by little we get rid of the dross, and we keep the essence of the experiences. And on the mental plane, in heaven or devachan, all those experiences are assimilated. So we have the gathering of experience, the purification, and the assimilation of the experience. So, yes. He's asking about this light that is usually seen when a person is dying, and many times there is a figure. All that, although it is with a very deep sense of peace, it's a very low experience in the process. That is only when the person is transitioning from the physical plane to the astral plane. But that transition, the only transition that may be difficult is a transition from the physical, plane to the etheric plane, what we call death, that may have some suffering. But as soon as the consciousness leaves the physical body, there is always a sense of peace, or most of the times, unless a person is dying in a very altered state, emotional state or mental plane state. But if the person dies normally, there is always a sense of peace, of unity, of happiness. And the figures, the same way that it is said that the same way that there are people receiving the child when it is being born, there are also entities, let's say, that are receiving people who are dying and are being newly born on the astral plane. And many times the mind of the person will, see that entity as the savior or a relative or whatever the conditioning of the mind is. Sometimes it is said that it can be a relative, it could be a spiritual being according to the evolution of the person, but that belongs to the first transition. Once that happens, there is no coming back. So all that the near-death experiences can tell us about is while the consciousness is still on the physical plane. So let me finish this, and this is the last thing that I want to say, and then we will open to question and answers. So the idea is that during that period in devachan, there is an assimilation of all the experiences and a development of faculties, virtues, skills, according to what happened during daily life. So that's when the soul really learns. We may be during our life fighting our whole life against a shortcoming or a tendency of our personality. And we may die without seeing much improvement. But the whole improvement will take place on devachan. And if we fought or tried to work with our shortcomings, in the next life, that shortcoming is not going to be there anymore, even if we die with it, because the whole process of assimilation is done in devachan. As the person becomes more spiritual, there is the possibility that much of that assimilation can be done during life also. But things that are very deeply rooted in the personality are not going to necessarily disappear during that life. And the next personality, when the whole process of assimilation finishes and there is a new process of reincarnation, this soul, after the experience during life, is wiser, is more powerful, is more skillful, whatever way you want to say it. And the idea is that the germs, the seeds, for all our tendencies, our lower tendencies, material tendencies, are waiting for us as the soul, outside devachan. When the soul incarnates again, these old seeds that couldn't be like cooked, if you cook a seed, then it cannot sprout again. But all those seeds that couldn't be cooked, that we couldn't work on during our daily life, will be retaken, and during our new incarnation, they will still be there. But now the soul is a little wiser, a little more powerful or skillful. So it will be able to take care of these tendencies in a better way. Sometimes only one life is not enough, for a soul to be able to get rid of some tendency. It depends on the maturity of the person. But there is always an improvement in this sense. So the idea is try to burn all the seeds that you can during your physical life, and your personality next time will be much more improved. And if you think, oh, but I'm not going to remember, what's the point? When probably you said that in your previous life, and now this life, you feel it as real as you felt the previous one. So in the next life, you will feel it as real as now. It's just like saying, oh, but tomorrow is tomorrow. I will eat all that I want now, and tomorrow, who knows? And then tomorrow we are with a stomachache, and we feel it real, even if when we were imagining that tomorrow was unreal. So that's more or less the idea of the process. And the message, I think, is that it is very important. One more thing, we stay 100 years on the physical plane, let's say. In the theosophical view, in normal cases, for a more or less spiritual person, the spiritual person can stay on the inner planes up to 1,200 years. That's our real life. Our real life, most of our life, is spent on the inner planes. The life on the physical plane is a very short, relatively speaking, very short passing experience. If because of this passing experience, we gather more desires, more cravings, we are making our real life more difficult after death. That's our real life. That's our home. Our home is this state in devachan. That's what we really are for the time being. So the idea is this life should be our way to work out all the tendencies that we have, trying to realize the truth here. And then our real life that comes after death will be more blissful and fulfilling and completely beyond what we can imagine. So that's more or less what I wanted to share with you. There are many other things, of course, but I think that this gives a more or less complete view. And now we can open to question and answers. Wait for the mic so that people on the internet can listen to it. There is somebody there that was asking for a question. Or a comment also. You can.
Well, I'm getting the impression that from what you say that the whole point is the reincarnation, to reincarnate. I would assume there comes a point when you have developed to a point where you can go beyond the higher mental and actually reach the universal self. Is that really what you're saying, that you're repeating the process, and I think in reincarnation they call that karma, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so let's take a person like Mother Teresa.
Mm-hmm.
Whether she may have been in an advanced reincarnation state, according to
Mm-hmm.
this theory,
Mm-hmm.
and at the time of her death, she might have gone through this whole process and just gone right to the universal self. Is that a correct understanding of what you said?
Yes, yes. The idea reincarnations are like going to school. You go to school because you have to learn, but you go to school eventually to get out of school, you know, once you learned everything. So the reincarnation is something that we go through just because we didn't realize the truth, because we are identified with the physical plane. What brings us back to the physical plane is our attachment and it's a very metaphysical attachment that I'm talking about. It's our need for sentient life. For example, if you meditate, sometimes you may reach a very peaceful or blissful state in meditation. Why do you ever come back from that meditation? Because that happens naturally. You know, you are in a meditation, you are in this very peaceful state, but little by little, the state wears off by itself. It's not that you say, most of the time, it's not that you say, okay, meditation ended. What happens is that the mind begins to go out of that state and come back to the normal state, which usually has conflict and suffering, along with pleasure and happiness also. But why do we ever come back from that state of meditation? I'm not saying that we should stay there. I'm talking about the process. There is a thirst for experience that we have as consciousness, as souls. So that thirst for experience brings us back to reincarnation. With all this process of evolution that happens, this thirst for experience on the lower planes gradually disappears, because we discover that this is our real home. It's just like the prodigal son. You know, the prodigal son was at home with the father. He craves for the world. He leaves the father and goes to the world and has all the experiences in the world and suffers and has pleasure and this and that, until he realizes, I don't need this. I was okay with my father. So he comes back to the father, now without being able to be tempted by the world, because he was there, he saw what the world was, he went through that, and he realized that he doesn't want that. So this is more or less the same. Our home is our real self. During the incarnations, little by little, we lose that need for gratification on the lower planes. When that happens, there is what in India they call liberation. Liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, or nirvana, or in whatever way they call it. So at that point, there is a realization of this higher self, and then a realization that that higher self is nothing but the one, and there is an extinction of that higher self. Now, what state of consciousness or state of non-consciousness is left? That's a dispute that there are in different traditions, because whatever is beyond the individuality is something that we cannot conceive. So some traditions describe that as the pure self, some traditions as the non-self, emptiness in Buddhism. So that's a question that would require a whole week discussing, and we wouldn't get to an agreement. But the point is that, yes, once this thirst for conditioned existence disappears, there is a realization of the truth and letting go of the illusion. And in Theosophy, it is said that with that there is an end for human experience, but there are higher cycles of evolution. Not most traditions stop at that point and they say there is liberation or nirvana and that's it. But that's the idea.
Let me ask you one final question. I understood you to say that in the case of death, physical, the end of physical life, there's a time period in which the mental state or the consciousness leaves the physical body and goes to the astral state. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about cremation is so popular these days. Mm-hmm. People are doing more and more of it. How would the decision of cremation impact this process as opposed to burial in the ground, let's say?
In the Theosophical view, in a very positive way. Because as long as the physical body and the etheric double are there is like a magnetic link with those bodies that consciousness has with those bodies. If the person was detached from the body, it doesn't matter. Pretty much, the consciousness of that person doesn't care about the body. But most people are attached to their body. So many times, the presence of the body there acts as a kind of anchor to consciousness to move, beyond the contact with the physical plane. So usually it is recommended in this view to cremate the body or to throw it to, the vultures or whatever thing, whatever process that makes the body as an entity disappear as fast as possible. So I know that that's not the Christian view, but the explanation is that you cut off the link with the body that we are supposed to let go of.
We have a couple questions from cyberspace here. Dave in New York asks, many times in our discussions we talk about that in-between life, prior to the next incarnation. Some think the monad chooses its next set of parents, sex, etc. I see this more as a result of karma attraction and not a direct choosing. I wonder what your thoughts and what does Theosophy teach on this? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, usually what is said is that as we don't really choose consciously and directly our next life, unless the person is really spiritual. We are thrown back into reincarnation, regulated by karma, by this law of causes and effects, and karma will put us in the perfect conditions for us to keep growing spiritually. Now, we can say that we chose that with our actions unconsciously. It's like we don't choose to have a stomachache when we eat a lot, but our action chose it. So in a sense, you chose it. So the next incarnation is the result of what we do. So in a sense, we are choosing it, but not usually in the Theosophical view, the idea is that not in this very conscious way, that you say, okay, these are the parents, because the working out of karma is very complex, and unless the higher ego is very evolved, doesn't have the wisdom or the view, the vision, to know what is best. So usually happens more aided by the universal laws.
I was wondering, once you reach the universal, self spirit, then you don't reincarnate anymore?
No, you could reincarnate to help humanity. That's the idea of in Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, the idea of spiritual teachers, enlightened beings coming and reincarnating voluntarily, and in that case it's voluntarily, and they can choose where, how, to serve as spiritual teachers of humanity or to help humanity in some way or the other. But the center of consciousness is freed from the compulsion of rebirth. But in these cases, consciousness doesn't really merge with the spiritual universal self. That's the idea of a bodhisattva. They can become merged with the universal self in a state that is far beyond anything we can imagine, but they give up this possibility because once they merge with the universal self, there is no way to come back to the lower realms. So the idea is that they give up that possibility, and they still remain chained to the lower realms with all the suffering that involves, for the sake of humanity. It's just saying, you deserve vacations in a paradisiac island, and then you say, no, I'll stay here to help people. I'm not taking the vacations. So it's kind of like that in a very lower way what they do. Most people say, oh yes, I will give up devachan, I will give up nirvana to come back and help, but we don't know what we are talking about. Are we doing that in life? Do we give up pleasures to help people? Do we give up our money or our spare time to help people? If we are doing that, then we are treading the path of the bodhisattva, in the Theosophical view. Otherwise, it's just an imagination. But eventually we get there, as we realize more and more this unity, the sense of love develops more than the sense of self, the gratification, and little by little we do that.
There's another question from cyberspace here. You touched on it already. I've heard that meditation is described as preparation for death, insofar as we learn to stop identifying with the body during the process of meditation. Mm-hmm. Is this an accurate view? And do those who meditate die more consciously than non-meditators?
Mm-hmm. I would say yes, but I wouldn't narrow this possibility to the practice of meditation. Our whole life is a process, or should be a process, of breaking the identification with the personality. So meditation may help as long as we are trying to do it also during our daily life. And on the other hand, if we do it during our daily life, and we cannot meditate, if we are really doing it during our daily life, then we don't need meditation. Usually we need meditation as far as it is possible, because it is a training so that we can extend it during our life. Now, what is meditation? Again, it can be a sitting meditation, or it can be walking in a state of awareness, or whatever your life allows. Sitting meditation is also a training to try to discipline your mind at a certain point in your development. But in certain situations, these are different things that we can do at different points of our lives. Now, the point is that during our life, we should be trying to break this identification. And how do we do it? By meditation, for example, or when we have an emotion, instead of just letting the emotion drag us in that reaction, we try to watch the emotion. There are different stages. For example, in a normal person, the person has a violent emotion. That person acts guided by that emotion, and also the mind begins to plan how to fulfill that anger, with trying to think a way or the other to get revenge. It can be in a little way, I'm not talking, or trying to see how to damage the person that made me suffer. So that is a state of complete identification with the emotions. Then the second stage is when we recognize these emotions are not good emotions, and we start fighting them. That is the beginning of a breaking of identification, because we are now consciously say, wait, I don't want this. I'm not this emotion. This emotion is in me, but I'm not this emotion. Now, a further step is when we can watch that emotion with equanimity, because we recognize not only that I'm not this emotion, but I'm actually beyond the emotions. So we are able to watch the emotion without being dragged by that, and without even fighting it. And the further stage is when the emotion dies by itself. There is not even the consciousness of fighting the emotion or watching the emotion. So all this process is a process of breaking the identification. As we do that, then we are generating a very subtle and high state of devachan, state of bliss and unity. And the life after death, that kind of life after death makes worth any kind of suffering that we go through in our daily life. Of course, when we are going through suffering, we don't like it. And the promise of something beyond is not necessarily, all that effective. But knowing these things gives us a different perspective so that we can go through daily life in a different way. So yes, the whole idea of meditating, watching ourselves, and the whole spiritual path is intended to produce this identification, and the whole process post-mortem is completely different.
I have a question about reincarnation. Let's say, for example, I was reincarnated 100 times. Mm-hmm. And after that, I will be able to see all my incarnation, because, let's say, during the hypnotize, I can get past regress and I can go to my previous reincarnation. Can you tell about this a little bit?
Mm-hmm. All these things are very complex, so to give a definite answer is kind of tricky. But generally speaking, in Theosophy, it is said that the memory of all the past reincarnations are at the level of our higher self, not lower. Lower, there may be a reflection of that memory, but that reflection can be also very distorted. So for example, with techniques of hypnosis, we could perceive a previous incarnation if for any reason that incarnation was very fast, with a few years separating from the previous one. But it's not, I don't know if we really can see, many incarnations in the past. Many times in the regressions, people claim to be kings, very important people, Very few were just normal people as we are. Most of us are just normal people. Yeah, I had a job, I had a family. So I don't know how much our psyche is creating a story, which doesn't mean that it's not therapeutic. Because even if it is not a previous reincarnation and it's an enactment of our unconscious mind, there is there a lesson. There is there something that we can realize. And it doesn't matter if it was a previous reincarnation or not. There is something there that is being shown to the conscious mind that could be useful to understand. But from the theosophical view, as far as we know, because all the information is limited, it's not that any one tradition has all the answers, but it's not likely that the incarnations are so easily seen. However, when the person is really spiritual and can reach a conscious union with the higher self in devachan, in that state, that person is able to see all the previous reincarnations. And also, it is said that every person, when is about to incarnate, sees the general plan for the life that is to begin, and what the causes to be worked out are. So, but then that usually most of us lose the memory of that view, that vision.